Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast where we explore the bold ideas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected solutions shaping the future of ethical business. Today on the show, we're learning what it really takes to expand Heathrow while claiming climate leadership, and whether Jet Zero is a viable vision or just high-altitude spin. We're grounding this in Politico Europe's deep dive, Here's the Climate Toll of Britain's New Heathrow runway, which outlines the emissions trade-offs of airport expansion and the gamble on green tech as justification. Our guest is Charlie Garner, Policy and Advocacy Lead at Clean Tech for UK, with deep experience spanning industrial decarbonisation, carbon capture, and clean tech innovation. Charlie, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show today. I know you and I met some time ago, and I've been looking forward to this one for a while. Thank you for giving up your time this Tuesday morning.
No worries. It's great to be here, Charlie. Thanks so much for having me. And it feels like it's been a long time coming. I'm sure we've got lots to talk about, and the world's a strange place. So it feels like an opportune moment to really get stuck in on some of these topics. So thanks for having me.
Oh, brilliant stuff, Charlie. I feel like we've got our title for the show already. The world's a strange place. I think we'll just leave it there, and we can have the rest of it follow through. Now, Charlie, I very, very briefly introduced your role, Policy and Advocacy Lead, and obviously mentioned Clean Tech for UK. But for those of our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of the organisation and perhaps aren't clear on what your role actually pertains to, would you mind just giving us a little bit more detail around what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work for an organisation called Clean Tech for UK. We are part of a broader sort of clean technology movement across Europe. So we have regional initiatives placed around different European jurisdictions. For the UK, my role is to help sort of manage our relationship with government. What we do essentially is to bridge the gap between climate technology innovators that are working on the really exciting kit that we need to solve the climate challenges that we see today, the investment community, primarily those that are trying to support the scaling of those technologies, and policymakers. So trying to sort of work with policymakers, the innovators, the finance community, to think a bit more creatively about how to design policy and regulation to kind of help scale those technologies. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell. We're a relatively new organization, but we've had pretty big impact so far, and it's been really exciting to sort of work with two governments in the UK, as we've recently have had a change in government, we should also say we work cross economy, so we work across all sectors, but obviously today's topic is very much focused on aviation.
And Charlie, I have to admit, even I wasn't absolutely understood the nature of clean tech and the fact that you've got multiple jurisdictions across Europe. Just talk us through kind of how are we doing here in the UK from a clean tech perspective compared to perhaps some of your European counterparts?
It's a very good question. I think the UK favours quite comparably to the rest of Europe. Obviously, I think the UK has its own strengths. Being an island country, we have a serious amount of opportunities when it comes to the kind of conventional renewables or set of renewables that we're looking to sort of build out. But I think we have also had a lot of political challenges that have meant that lots of the progress that we'd have hoped to have seen in the past few years has somewhat stalled. But I think we're moving into a new phase where I'm hoping that certainly from our perspective, we can really, influence the pace and scale of the change that we need to see. So I would probably mark us around a sort of 7 out of 10, if I might. But yeah, lots of work to do, I would say.
I love that. The 7 out of 10 is the perfect self-scoring. I feel it gives you that sense of opportunity for improvement, but still doing a good job. Perfectly positioned.
Absolutely.
Well, Charlie, look, we're gonna touch upon more of the work that you guys are doing at Clean Tech for UK throughout the conversation. I should say, for any of our listeners and viewers that are immediately interested in finding out more about the organisation and Charlie's background in particular, you guys can check out his LinkedIn, and we'll be linking to the website for Clean Tech for UK, etc. So you can go and explore further. But Charlie, as with all guests that come on the Responsible Edge, there's such intrigue about how you have found yourself as policy and advocacy lead for this organization. And I really want to unpick, if you like, a bit more of the story that's led you to this position and working with this organization. So start wherever you like in terms of those kind of formative experiences that have sort of driven you to do what you've done. But just talk us through a timeline of events of your career today.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, what's quite interesting is it's kind of gone full circle because I spent most of my childhood wanting to be a commercial pilot. Right. And I was sort of fascinated by aviation, fascinated by flight, and came sort of very close to committing to that career. But I sort of, whenever all of my friends went off to university to kind of study, I was sort of challenging myself to sort of turn up at a local airfield and try to explore that as an option. And I think over the months post people leaving for university and me sort of being stuck at home, I sort of slowly realised that maybe this perhaps wasn't what I wanted to do, and I sort of decided maybe I wanted to explore the other sort of big passion in my life, which unfortunately, I'm a bit of an obsessive hobbyist, and I found most of my passion and hobbies interact with the sort of physical, natural world around us. Mm-hmm. And so I became very, very, and I have always been very interested in sort of the environment, the planet, the climate. And
Charlie, sorry to interrupt you there in full flight, but what are people are going to immediately be thinking? Like, what are those hobbies? Like, have we got ourselves like an adventurous climber, or have we got ourselves like a wildist? And what have we got?
You're pretty much spot on. So my dad, also a bit of an obsessive hobbyist. He's got a library of books at home, all of which are climbing books. So at the age of 10, I was sort of dangling off a rope, and that's been, a long-standing passion of mine, is to be out in the mountains and rock climbing. And so that's kind of, where that kind of passion has come from. But to kind of come back on your point, or your comment, I sort of quite quickly realized that I wanted to do something that at least kind of positively impacted that sort of environment around me. And, I decided to go off and study environmental science, which after, a short period of being at university, realized that I wanted to sort of affect the change at the top level if I could. And it sort of fell backwards into policy, I guess. I did sort of study a master's in carbon management up in Edinburgh, which off the back of that have found myself working in policy at the intersect between kind of the technologies that we need to kind of solve the climate challenges we see today, the investment community and policymakers.
And was that, and just so that I'm clear on that point, Charlie, you kind of viewed the opportunity of working in policy as being the strongest or the biggest lever, if you like, for supporting real fundamental change. That was why policy in particular, as opposed to going, the entrepreneurial route, or perhaps sort of working in the finance side of things. The key for you was, I've identified policy as my opportunity to make the biggest change or have the biggest impact. Is that a fair sort of synopsis?
Yeah, absolutely. So and I think part of it has been the opportunity to work with multiple subsets of stakeholders. So government work very differently to businesses in kind of big corporate, does work quite differently to small scale innovators. But having the opportunity to work with all of these different stakeholders to kind of work through some of the challenges that we ultimately need to solve to get to where the government wants us to get, and hopefully the rest of the general public want to get. I think that was, for me, the most fascinating way to get involved in some of this stuff.
And how long, Charlie? So that's you having done your masters. Did you join Clean Tech straight out of having completed your masters, or have you done all the roles before then?
No, when I finished my master's, I went to work for a trade association,
Hmm.
working to try to get carbon capture and storage off the ground in the UK. Which, for those that don't know, carbon capture and storage is it has been a fairly controversial technology for a number of reasons, but ultimately, what you do is you try and capture the CO2 that comes out of the flue stack of big industrial processes, and you pipe that carbon underground and into a series of underground aquifers off the coast of the kind of eastern shoreline under the North Sea. And the idea is that you can permanently store that carbon. So I worked for this company for a couple of years and got lots of experience working both on sort of UK policy, but also EU policy as well. So kind of, got some really good experience working across these two different jurisdictions that operate quite differently, actually.
Well, just picking up on that, Charlie. Can you just touch on? I know it's a different topic of conversation for today, but talk us through some of the controversies around carbon capture and storage, and perhaps some of the nuances and differences between operating in Europe versus the UK. Sorry, a two-sided question, but interested.
No, not at all.
Those points.
Yeah, so obviously it very much depends who you speak to. So I'll provide the balanced response, which is that for the most part, with carbon capture and storage, what you are ultimately trying to do is prolong the industries that we have been using for a long time. So when we think about these big industrial processes that require huge amounts of fossil input, you can ultimately prolong their use into the future and supposedly make them net zero compliant. The challenge is that some lobby groups believe that because you are ultimately prolonging the use of fossil fuels, you are not going to align those industries with the future or tomorrow. And there's a view that it can be quite expensive, and it probably will be quite expensive. And for many kind of technology pathways, it's sometimes believed as unproven. So I think the balanced view is that there's a long way to go to seeing those technologies really truly impacting at scale. The kind of good news is that the government has been doing a lot of really good work on carbon capture and storage, and we're seeing in the UK that lots of different kind of policy and regulation has been born out of the kind of appetite for both industry, investors, and also the general public to see some of those technologies succeed. But it's certainly not the kind of shared view across the board, should we say.
Charlie, that was brilliantly explained and clarified on that point. I'm going to push you though now for your own, you're going to come on to talk about, obviously, you're the next stage in your career, but having worked in the area and been, on the ground firsthand from a policy perspective, where do you sit on the argument of whether or not it's a good, and I'm going to overly simplify things, a good technology and a good investment, or a bad one?
It's really, you're going to really test me now. So the way that I see it is, it's, ultimately we need to have those industries in the future. For the UK, there's a sort of UK PLC argument where we've had these really sort of thriving industries producing steel, producing different types of chemicals, power, all of different sort of outputs that ultimately we'd like to have them onshore or stay onshore in the UK. And there are technologies that you can use potentially to develop some of, or to produce some of these outputs. So I think the jury's still out. I think it's really difficult to have a view, but I would say a lot of work has been done on it, and I think the train has kind of already left the station in a way. And so I think, from my perspective, working in policy, a lot of the time we have to work quite pragmatically. what the government and what industry wants to do. And so in that sense, I think I can see it playing a role. And if that's what the government's going to do, I'm sort of, in a way, here to support it as best as I can, provided that it doesn't overshadow all of the other innovation that we need to make the transition to a sort of net positive climate future possible, if that makes at all sense.
That makes a lot of sense, Charlie. And I have to admit, just as I heard, as you were explaining your position there, I just, I can really understand how your role, and I know we're now talking about perhaps the role at Clean Tech, like there's so much of that kind of pragmatic, realistic sort of diplomacy that needs to be going on in the way that you approach things in order to ensure that, we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world that needs to be managed in the realist sort of context in which we find it. Out of interest, when you think about sort of where you are in your career at this point, and you think about from this point onwards, like the rest of your career, like, and you get to the end of it, what would success to you look like in terms of what you want to achieve with your career?
Gosh, so it's really interesting. When I sort of joined Clean Tech for UK, I had the front of my mind was, okay, what do you want to get out of this role? And it's the only thing really, if I can be truly honest with the podcast, is to make as much impact as possible, to honestly just, I've seen so many amazing innovations and so many just people so much smarter than me doing these incredible things. And if I can, play my part in helping to sort of deliver some of those projects in one way or another, that would be success to me.
I think it's fascinating to think of somebody like yourself who's done what you've done already to this point, just, reflecting on, I guess, what sort of impact would look like. And you described that perfectly. I totally get it. Like, if you could be part of being the catalyst and the facilitator, if you like, to support, some of these innovations coming to impact things at scale, I can really understand how that would be a very satisfying experience for you personally and in your career to achieve. Let's move on now, Charlie, if possible. Would you mind providing just a brief introduction and overview to the Politico piece that we're going to be discussing this week? And I should say, obviously, I know we've had a whistle-stop tour on you. As I mentioned, your LinkedIn profile will be linked to everywhere so that people can go and check out your background in a bit more detail. But for now, would you mind just providing a bit of an overview of the piece we're going to be discussing?
Sure. So the big sort of news in the aerospace sector in the UK has been that the third runway at Heathrow has been green-lighted by the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. But the Politico article speaks to the fact that plans to expand with a third runway could add up to 2.4 million tons of CO2 annually by 2050, even after accounting for cleaner fuels like sustainable aviation fuel. And many of the critics are arguing that this undermines the UK's climate commitments, especially as the benefits largely serve frequent flyers and wealthier households. So really, really difficult challenge and a pointy article to be discussing.
And out of interest, what did you, because as you say, a pointy article to be discussing, and there's many routes that we could go down with this, but from your perspective, with your hat on, what really struck you about the piece that you think was notable, or is there anything that you sort of disagreed with that was in it?
So I think that I have a sort of personal view, a sort of off the record view, that I think it is a bit of a shame that the government is considering airport expansion in the face of growth. That's ultimately why the Chancellor is doing this. But I can see as a government that has been struggling with growth, there is a need to explore this. The challenging part of this article for me is that I think most of the technologies that are hopefully going to be available to us simply are not ready yet. So in the article, they talk about something called sustainable aviation fuel, which is a drop-in solution to the existing fleet of aircraft that we have today, where the fuel that you put into the fuel is sourced from sustainable feedstocks. So things like used cooking oils, advanced feedstocks, things like kind of old sort of woody biomass, things that you can kind of take from, you can use things like household waste as an example, and you can produce this fuel. But ultimately in the UK, we don't have any of these projects in the ground and being built, and we're relying on an existing stream of feedstock. And as a result, we're importing a lot of the fuel that is the feedstock that is required for these sustainable aviation fuels. So, we're creating this huge risk around the fuels that we're using for the future. And the big thing that's therefore sticking out to me is that we need to move quicker and we need to get on with things. And if the government wants to consider expanding Heathrow, and I think Gatwick as well, we need to do more than just SAF. We need to kind of accelerate all of the technologies that we have in our wheelhouse to sort of minimize the climate impact of these things.
And Jay and Charlie, the point is with that, and again, sorry for oversimplifying things from my own sort of simple mind, if you like. But the key here is that essentially the government is acknowledging that there's the potential impact from additional kind of carbon emission perspective, 2.4 million tons per annum that you've alluded to. But that they're suggesting that can be mitigated with some of the sort of the solutions, the climate tech solutions that are at play or are accessible to us. Your point is that that is true hypothetically. It's just that we have no way near invested and developed and matured those technologies in order to account for this increase in carbon emission.
Yes, exactly. And, I think in the article, they suggest that the government is insisting that the project won't proceed unless overall emissions targets are met. But the conflict of that is that most of the experts warn that the models totally underestimate the total climate impact of building a third runway. And so it feels to me like there's a lot of uncertainty. And that is quite worrying from a climate impact perspective. So I think just from our perspective, from Cleantech for UK's perspective, and perhaps we'll come on to talk about the report, is that we need to kind of accelerate the full portfolio of technologies in order to sort of minimize the impact of these decisions, because it seems as though the government is going to press ahead with these decisions and pretty quickly.
And on that point, Charlie, like let's dive into that from a policy perspective. Like, what is the UK government not doing at the moment that they could be doing in order to create that kind of fertile ground, if you like, for the development of these technologies at a faster rate that would then mitigate the issues around increased carbon emissions from things like the third runway at Heathrow? Like, what would you like if you could just say, right, the UK government is now committed to this? What would those things look like?
So what's quite interesting is the government has spent a lot of time and effort working on the policies around sustainable aviation fuel, which I think is a really good thing. It's they've done a lot of good work. Specifically, they have introduced something called the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Mandate, which will essentially mandate airlines to put a blend of sustainable aviation fuel into the tanks of the aircraft that fly from Heathrow and the rest of the airports in the UK. And that's good. And over the years, that mechanism will ratchet up. So airlines will have to put more and more of this sustainable aviation fuel into their fuel tanks. And they've also done something really positive, which we hope to see at the start of 2026, which is the introduction of something called the revenue certainty mechanism, which will essentially help projects that are trying to get off the ground manage the risk around price fluctuations in the value of these fuels. And so the government's doing some good stuff there, and we certainly commend them for that. I think one of the risks that we see is that there is a real innovation to scale funding gap to keep a lot of the other UK clean tech aviation companies at home. And so when we think about innovation, we think about trying to get these really, really unique ideas at the very, very early stage through this really tricky financial period called the Valley of Death, which is essentially where you have venture capitalists that fund these really cool and interesting and impactful ideas. They take on a lot of risk, and eventually they sell the company. They've done their bit. Those companies are then left to find the next round of funding. And unfortunately, because they are still at lower technology readiness level, lots of these big institutional banks that ultimately we need to help sort of fund some of these projects and technologies, they won't touch those because they're still too risky. And so this is where the UK government has to, in our eyes, look at that risk and see how they can be, how they can kind of support companies through that really tricky financing period. And we're not sort of suggesting that they should pay for everything, but we think using mechanisms that are within their wheelhouse to kind of help manage those risks by blending finance between public and private, if that makes total sense and isn't too complicated.
Well, Charlie, it's definitely not too complicated let's test it with me, because I sometimes don't understand these things particularly well. But what you're describing there, so the ultimate lever that the government does have to pull, you've alluded to at the end, is potentially subsidizing or supporting those businesses in some direct financial way, perhaps not in the full investment requirement, but certainly supporting them in some way financially. That's the lever that they have to pull to account for that. What did you call it? The Valley of something? The
Valley of Death.
The Valley of Death. I mean, my goodness, that's as dun as you could possibly get. So just to kind of, I suppose when we think of things in terms of financing, you have when you're trying to sort of scale an innovation or an idea, you go through these rounds from something called pre-seed, seed, Series A to Series B, Series C, and they all kind of represent different sizes of kind of funding levels, if that makes sense. And between Series A, which is from about 5 million. Some of the venture capitalists might argue with me on this, but it's around sort of 5 million up to Series B, which is a much larger amount. Through that period, it's really quite tricky for some of these innovators to get funding. And so it's a real structural weakness in the UK's particularly for aviation, the innovation pipeline, but actually across the kind of broader climate tech sector, it's a real challenge. And so when I was sort of suggesting that the government could step in to some degree, there are, mechanisms that we have in our wheelhouse, things like the British Business Bank, which is it's a bank that the UK has been championing for a long time to help small businesses to grow by sharing some of the risk. But also the Labour government has done very well at sort of repurposing what used to be something called the UK Infrastructure Bank, which is now called the National Wealth Fund, which we think should be enabled to sort of co-invest at that stage and provide some of the kind of coordinated follow-on capital to help some of those companies get through that valley of death and to scale so that we can actually see them, delivering flights in the future. But I should also add, Charlie, that the aviation sector is hugely capital intensive. There are, as you can imagine, a whole host of safety regulations that make it very difficult to certify new aircraft types. And so part of the argument for us is that we need to be getting on with this stuff now so that in the future, 10, 20, even 30, even after 2050, we can see some of these technologies, truly impacting what we do in the sort of aviation sector. It's fascinating, Charlie. You've explained that brilliantly. Thank you for hand holding me through it. It's fascinating though, isn't it? It's almost comes back to the sort of the beginning of the first point that you highlighted with this, though that it's, it strikes me as concerning, if you like, that we have a scenario in which the UK government is aiming to do something like this in terms of the investment in the third runway, but isn't at the same time understanding and appreciating that in order to do that and in order to enable the technologies that are going to allow for that kind of investment to occur and for it not to ultimately damage our environmental commitments, if you like, that they haven't provided the pathway, if you like, in terms of investment in these technologies and the fertile ground, if you like, for these technologies to develop and grow. And that's really at the heart, I think, of what you've just explained, unless you might tell me otherwise.
Absolutely. And I think often, one of the challenges that I've seen in sort of, working in this space for a little while is that there are relatively tribal views as to sort of what technologies people think or can see being technologically viable in the future. And the thing that I would sort of point towards is that when we talk about innovation, take the aircraft for instance, no one dismissed the aircraft just because there wasn't a walkway yet. Visionaries kind of built the first plane and the rest follows. And a lot of the work that went into the first aircraft that we saw, however many, you're testing my history knowledge now, but a long time ago, ultimately a lot of the work that went into that was purely through the lens of trying to get that first aircraft in the sky. And I think we need to look past this kind of near-term critical challenge of Heathrow to some degree and think about what's the bigger picture and what do we want to see, future. And that's ultimately what I think the government should be trying to do.
It's fascinating. It's and then almost sort of the counter argument to all of this is, well, if you want, and I can just envisage the government spokesman sitting alongside you, Charlie, who would be sitting there going, well, guys, it's a chicken and egg scenario. If you want us to pull the levers of subsidy and investment into these businesses that are going to realize these sort of technological advances and ultimately aid our our transition, if you like, as a country, then we need to find ways of stimulating growth and investment in the country, and one of the ways of doing that is to develop our third runway. So it's and coming back to the beginning of this conversation when you were brilliantly talking about your time working on kind of carbon capture and storage. It's just all a bit messy and muddy, isn't it? And clumsy, and there isn't a perfect solution. Like, you mentioned, like, personally, you look at the investment in the third runway, and it doesn't really sit particularly well with you. If I recall your conversation, again, personal perspective, but that was your view of things. Like, yeah. What if the UK government is not looking to invest in things like a third runway in Heathrow, but is still obviously concerned around growth and stimulation of the economy? What else could they be doing in your mind?
I think probably I probably bring it back to a kind of more holistic point, which is that we recognize, and I recognize, and I'm sure many people recognize, that the system in which we live in requires economic growth. It's essential for improving people's living standards, funding public services, enabling societies to kind of tackle the sort of long-term challenges that we see today. But traditional economic growth, especially in fossil fuel heavy industries like manufacturing, like transport, like energy, often leads to higher greenhouse gas emissions. So you have this cycle of more production, more consumption, and more energy use, which generally mean more CO2, unless the economy is decoupled from carbon. So the key issue isn't growth per se, it's kind of what kind of growth. And if growth is decarbonized and circular, it can support both our climate goals. But if extractive and polluting, then it ultimately accelerates this challenge. And so I think there's not one sector that I think the UK doesn't have an opportunity to succeed in. I think the big thing for us is thinking of things through the lens of what are the sort of green growth opportunities. So, if the UK has, a budding ecosystem of innovators working in, for instance, the built environment sector that can support the transition of how we build our homes, how we sort of consume energy in our homes, and off the back of that, are there sort of export opportunities to scaling some of those technologies? So can we sort of sell some of the IP and the kind of insights and technologies that we develop out of trying to kind of bring those technologies through? So that's kind of my sort of very bureaucratic answer, but
Charlie, I sorry to interrupt you, but I love that, and I want to throw something again, an informed view, but from a marketing kind of comms branding perspective that I kind of bring to this. I think what you've described there to me, like I feel like one of the things that we could do with more of as a country, if you like, is having real clarity around what we want and I know I'm going to make it sound silly, but what our sort of brand proposition is as a country. And we're in this like unique period in the history of our country whereby there's an opportunity to really think about what we want to be. And I think what you've just described to me there, if I've understood you correctly, is that there is opportunity, there is fertile ground if we make the right decisions from a policy perspective and therefore an investment perspective for us to actually become one of the leading countries in the world from a clean tech, a sustainable economies perspective. And I know those are huge generalizations, but why don't we create a brand vision for this country that ultimately captures that and then allows us to become world leading in that area? And as you say, then exports our ideas, our IP, etc., into other markets and ultimately create a new opportunity that way. Have I again oversimplified, but essentially, is that what you're saying, that that's the opportunity at play here?
Yeah, not at all. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And I think the interesting thing, what you've said there to me sounds as though it's like you're calling for a government strategy. What the government does, the Labour government, it produces its manifesto, it comes into power, and it starts to kind of build out its own identity and what it wants to do with the country. One of the things that the Labour government has kind of spat out is something called Clean Power 2030, which is essentially this really audacious and ambitious target to decarbonize the power system by 2030, which if you speak to any sort of expert, they will tell you that is absolutely audacious. It's such a difficult challenge, bordering on impossible. Nevertheless, they're showing a lot of ambition. The challenge ultimately then is how on earth do you deliver on that? So the government can have this brand, it can have this, we are going to do this, but ultimately the only way they can do that is if they deliver. And to give you an example of where things haven't gone so well is the government has been trying to make a decision on how it wants to sort of price electricity in the grid system. And this is going to be a real test of my knowledge because I'm not very good at explaining this, but ultimately the government wanted to decide whether it would price electricity kind of nationally or in these sort of smaller zones, depending on where renewable energy was placed. So if you were in a location where renewable energy was close to, you would receive cheaper energy. And the reason for that is that we have a lot of renewables in Scotland, but to transfer the electrons to Scotland, to the south of England, it's very inefficient and it's quite expensive. So the whole system has been. I'll leave it to the viewers to kind of explore this further on Google. But ultimately, what's happened is the government has taken a while to decide if it was going to sort of change the pricing structure of the electricity system, and as a result, it created a lot of uncertainty to investors. And ultimately has, in our view, delayed projects. And so that lack of decision has a big impact on how quickly we can build projects, how quickly we can sort of get to where we want to be, essentially.
And
if that makes sense.
I know, Charlie, you've nailed that, and we're going to come on to your magic wand in a second, and I'm preempting a potential use of your magic wand here. But I just think you've hit on something really clear in my mind, which is like, just envisage a business, like for a moment, that every 4 years created this almost sort of totally new kind of brand vision for itself that involved like changing, I guess, the fundamental values and the underlying kind of strategies that were going to be underpinned to deliver that vision. If you had a business like that, you're so right. Like, the partners of that business, the wider stakeholders, etc., would be kind of confused. Like, what the hell is it? It keeps changing and it keeps sort of shifting, and it's really difficult to therefore plan our engagements and our ways of working with said business as a result. So in a way, we're creating that confusion around what we are and what we're trying to be because of the way that our political system facilitates that kind of flipping and flopping, if you like, technical term, from one to the other. So I don't know, that's my immediate reflection on what you've described and the lack of clarity and uncertainty that results from that way of doing things. I'm fascinated, Charlie. I've preempted, so feel free to go off to something completely different here. But magic wand, if I was to hand you one and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Gosh. Okay. So I'm going to sort of, if I may, sort of shift the question just a little bit, just to kind of reflect the sort of world that I work in, which is around sort of policy and advocacy, which is very much related to the corporate world. So I would say that, the one thing that I could change about the way that the corporate world works and the way that advocacy works and essentially lobbying is that we really need to remove the tribal nature of lobbying at the expense of climate progress. We need unified voices working towards a shared goal. So one of the most under-discussed barriers to effective climate policy is having, this having momentum behind, a larger group of voices and opinions that are all working towards a shared goal. I would say what we need to change about the corporate world is that we are slightly hooked on growth. And in many political and industrial circles, lobbying efforts are often framed in terms of competition between sectors, competition between different ideologies or interest groups, rather than cooperation around a shared goal. And it's that kind of zero-sum thinking that can really stall and water down transformative policies, especially in areas like clean energy, decarbonisation, aviation, infrastructure we're talking about today. So that sort of coordination piece is really essential.
So here's the 64, well, I imagine $1 trillion question here for you, Charlie. Like, how do you facilitate that? Like, what, we have so many conversations on the responsible edge that broadly touch upon, the importance of collaboration and partnership and joined up thinking and all the rest of it. And everybody talks about how important it is and how, that's our sort of, our foundation, if you like, of real progress and consensus and movement and momentum behind enacting some of these things. $64 trillion question. How do we enable that?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I've got the best answer for it, but I'll give it a go. I think probably what's needed is a slightly new model of kind of climate lobbying rather. I think one that really values cross-sector collaboration. I think things like evidence-based policy making, long-term thinking. So like past this 4-year cycle that we see in current sort of government, the way that government works is, governments, they change usually after every couple of cycles, but they have 4 years to really imprint, make their mark on what they're trying to do. And I think stakeholders need to sort of step out of their silos, and we need to unite around shared infrastructure, policy stability, and fair investment frameworks that benefit the whole of the economy, not just one corner of it. And I think this is becoming ever more important in today's world, where we're we're living in a world where the electorate is becoming more and more disenchanted with politics. So trust in politics has been falling year on year for quite some time, and that is a real risk to making true progress. So, we need that unified voice, and from our perspective around the climate space. Building coalitions, that's the big one.
Building coalitions, that's the big one. Brilliant place to finish there, Charlie. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I know that was a whistle-stop tour. I know that we haven't even really had a chance to talk about your most recent report that's just been launched, which, in fact, just before we finish, because I know it's sort of hot off the press, if you like, would you mind just giving our listeners and viewers just a bit of an overview? We'll obviously link to the report in all of our materials. Would you mind just telling us about what was covered in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, Charlie, the two Charlies have been talking about aviation today and the conflicts that we're seeing with airport expansion. And our report, it looks at the full breadth of innovation that the UK has across the aviation space in the sort of technology aviation kind of clean tech space. And we look at the different investment data to where investors are finding different technologies in the space interesting, and how those companies are doing, what barriers they're finding to kind of scaling those technologies, and ultimately providing some recommendations to the government on how we think they could approach the aviation sector and the technologies within it in a more sort of holistic portfolio way, I guess, so that we can give the aerospace sector the best chance that it can to succeed and be aligned with our climate targets. I think that was probably the best way to describe the report, but I'll let readers or listeners go and have a little read if they can.
Well, Charlie, having I had a brief look at the report, and we're obviously going to digest into things a little bit more over the coming weeks as we look to publish today's show. I think you've nailed that summary, and obviously it aligns perfectly with some of the things that we spoke about today. So thank you for that. We'll obviously link to the report in all of our materials, as I mentioned. Charlie, thank you so much for joining me again. It's been great to have you on the show.
No worries. Thanks so much, Charlie. It's great to be here. Cheers.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A huge thank you to Charlie Garner for helping us navigate the altitude where policy, technology, and emissions ambition collide. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting, because trust isn't declared, it's earned. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.